Welcome to Heroic History English, the place where history isn't just told. It's brought to life in all its blood, fire, and glory. If this is your first time joining us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Because every single day, we plunge into stories where mighty empires rise, collide with thunderous force, and sometimes crumble beneath the crushing weight of ambition, steel, and fate. And if you're a returning viewer, well, you already know the drill. So, settle in, get comfortable, because I have another epic tale ready to unfold. Today, we journey back to 190 BC to the plains near the River Hermos, where the Battle of Magnesia took place. A confrontation that didn't just decide a single war, but rewrote the destiny of the ancient world. It was the final decisive moment that silenced the last true heir of Alexander the Great's legacy and marked the brutal dawn of Rome's unstoppable rise to global power. Two mighty armies stood across the field, east versus west. The old Hellenistic kingdoms clashing with the relentless force of a rising republic. What happened next would echo through history, forever shaping the balance of power for centuries to come. In the early 2nd century BC, the Mediterranean world was undergoing a period of great change. The Roman Empire, having defeated Carthage in the Second Punic War and conquered the Kingdom of Macedonia under Philip V, began to extend its influence beyond the Italian peninsula. Its military power and political influence now extended across the Balkans, pressing in on the Greek city-states, dominating the confederations that had been the ancient world's symbols of self-democratic rule. Meanwhile, in the east, another power was rising, the Seleucid Empire. Founded by the general Seleucus I Nicator after the death of Alexander the Great, the dynasty inherited the greatest part of the Greek legacy, a territory that stretched from Asia Minor to Persia, from the Syrian Sea to the golden sands of Bactria. Under Antiochus III, who was hailed as the Great, the Seleucid Empire entered a period of great prosperity. He continued to expand eastward, reconquering Bactria from 210 to 209 BC, and even advancing into India from 206 to 205 BC, leading many to believe that a reincarnation of Alexander had arrived. The eastern victories brought prestige, but did not satisfy the king's ambitions. After winning the Fifth Syrian War against Ptolemy and annexing Syria in 198 BC, Antiochus turned his attention westward. In 196 BC, taking advantage of the death of Attalus, the king of Pergamon, he attacked the Ptolemy-controlled cities of Asia Minor and the coastal region. The Seleucid crossing of the Hellespont and the rebuilding of Lysimachia and their expansion from Perinthus to Maronia in Thrace created independent city-states such as Smyrna and Lampsacus. Fear forced them to seek help from Rome. That same year, a Roman delegation arrived in Lysimachia to collect profits. But when the Romans demanded that Antiochus withdraw from Europe and restore autonomy to the Greek city-states of Asia Minor, the king replied that he was merely reviving the empire his ancestor Antiochus II Theos had built, while also strengthening Rome's hold on the telegraphed territories of Rhodes and its Greek allies. Tensions were further heightened when a ghost from the past appeared at Antiochus' court. Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who had sown terror in the Italian peninsula. had fled his homeland and sought refuge in Ephesus, the western capital of the Seleucid Empire. Although Rome initially remained cautious, the war party, led by Scipio Africanus, increasingly pressed for war. Meanwhile, Antiochus was backing Hannibal's plot to launch a coup against Roman power in Carthage. While in Greece, he was allied with the Aetolian League, which was eager to launch a full-scale attack against Rome. Finally, in September 192 BC, when the Aetolian general Thoas himself arrived at Ephesus to persuade Antiochus, the king agreed to a military invasion of Greece. He mobilized 10,000 infantry, 500 cavalry, 6 war elephants, and 300 ships. Not just an army, but a clear declaration that Seleucus would confront Roman hegemony. However, the pace was swift. After some initial gains in Thessaly, the Seleucid army was completely defeated at Thermopylae in 191 BC, and Antiochus retreated to Asia Minor. Nevertheless, he still hoped to turn things around locally. Here, he quickly revived the defenses around Sardis, the strategic center of Asia Minor, while reinforcing the fleet at Ephesus and re-equipping his powerful phalanxes, war elephants, and armored cavalry. But the Romans did not give him a chance to recover. With the help of their allies, Rhodes and Pergamon, the Seleucid fleet was quickly pushed back and the sea defenses collapsed. By the end of 190 BC, the Romans had crossed the Hellespont, the sacred boundary between Europe and Asia, and were on the Eastern Front. The expeditionary force, led by Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asioticus, and advised by his legendary brother Scipio Africanus, advanced inland from northwestern Anatolia. From Pergamon, they followed the Caicus and Hermos rivers, approaching Magnesia at Sipylum, where Antiochus had chosen to line up for the decisive battle. On the eastern plain of Magnesia, just across the Hermos, 2 giant armies faced each other. On one side was the battle-hardened army of the Roman Republic, which had just defeated Hannibal and subjugated Macedonia. On the other side was the last elite force of the Hellenistic world, the remnants of an empire that had dreamed of recreating the glory of Alexander. The Battle of Magnesia was no longer simply a confrontation between 2 nations. It was a judgment between 2 eras, between the imperial East and the new order that Rome was establishing with sword and fire. And only one side would be left standing when the sun set behind the Hermos Valley. As the Magnesian plains spread out under the morning mists of Asia Minor, 2 giant armies faced each other. Not just a clash of battle formations, but a clash of military doctrines, of visions of power. In the West, the Roman Republic threw its weight behind the battle, as if it understood that Magnesia would be the decisive battle for the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The supreme commander was Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asioticus. But the real heart of the campaign was his great brother, Scipio Africanus, who had defeated Hannibal at Zama. Though he was an advisor, Scipio Africanus was the architect of the strategy, the man who struck fear into the hearts of every enemy who faced him. They had a reliable ally, Eumenes II, king of Pergamon, who brought not only Anatolian-like cavalry, but also strategic wisdom. For Eumenes did not want Antiochus to restore his hegemony in Asia Minor, where Pergamon had worked so hard to build up its influence. The Roman army was now a combination of discipline and flexibility, crystallized by the long wars with Carthage and Greece. The two main legions, consisting of about 20,000 legionary infantry and Italian allies, were supported by more than 5,000 cavalry, 6,000 Greek soldiers, mostly light infantry, and 16 African war elephants, which Scipio kept in reserve because he knew they were no match for the size of the enemy's Indian elephants. Rome's ultimate weapon was not its soldiers. It was its ability to organize its forces, its flexible tactics, and, above all, its ability to coordinate its forces on the battlefield. By contrast, Antiochus III's Seleucid army was a colorful picture of a transcontinental empire. Antiochus mobilized every resource at his disposal, from 26,000 phalangists, including 10,000 professional and 16,000 semi-professional troops, to 6,000 cataphracts, 2,000 Royal Heavy Cavalry, a Gemma, 2,500 Galatian cavalry, and over 1,700 light cavalry from the nomads and Greek city-states. Antiochus directly commanded the right wing, where he placed the greatest trust in the heavy cavalry. His sons Seleucus and nephew Antipater commanded the left wing, while the center, with its phalanxes and war elephants, was led by Philip. It was the first time in history that a battle of such magnitude had been fought between the Hellenistic warfare model of the late Alexander period and the full-fledged Roman Republican tactics. On the Magnesian plains, both sides carried not only men and weapons, but also the future of the small Asian continent and the Greek world. From their winter camp at Sardis, the Roman Pergamon allied army began to march northeast, crossing the Hermos River, entering the Magnesia ad Sicilium plain, a vast strip of land between the Phrygius and Hermos rivers at the foot of Mount Cyprus, not far from Smyrna. This was the place where the Seleucid army won the Battle of Corupedium in 281 BC, and now, once again, became the decisive battle point. Antiochus III chose this place to deploy his army, with the advantage of the terrain gradually rising from the southeast to the northwest, stretching between the rivers like a natural fortress. Meanwhile, Scipio Asiaticus and Eumens to set up camp southwest of the plain, leaning against the Phrygius River, directly opposite the Seleucid army line. Both armies understood that this place would decide the fate of Western Asia in the next century. After several days of stalemate, with neither side daring to launch a full-scale attack, the situation began to change. Realizing that continuing to hold out would demoralize the troops, deplete their supplies, and that further delay would see Roman reinforcements arrive to take over command, Scipio was forced to act. He decided to move his army closer to the east, to the area where the Phrygius River suddenly changed course, forming a 90 bend. Here, the Roman formation began to expose its right flank, a weakness that Antiochus immediately recognized. At dawn, on the third day after the last Roman deployment, Antiochus accepted the challenge. The great battle officially began. Antiochus opened fire first, launching an attack from the right wing, the southeast, where he commanded the cataphract cavalry, the Dahe light cavalry, and the camel-mounted archers from Arabia. This force broke through the left wing of the Pergamon army, causing Eumens' formation to fall into disarray. Forced to retreat behind the Phrygius River to reorganize, Eumens was almost eliminated from the battle line in the early stages, In his eager pursuit, Antiochus led his army away from the center, leaving a dangerous gap in the main formation. Meanwhile, the Seleucid center, consisting of more than 16,000 phalangites with sarissa spears, lined up from the foot of the mountain to the west. Supported by 54 war elephants and Thracian, Galatian, and Syrian archers. But despite its strength and numbers, this formation lacked mobility. The Romans did not attack head-on, but instead used a flanking tactic. They took advantage of the flat terrain, slipping through the gaps between the war elephants to attack the phalanx's flank, which the sarissa warriors could not turn around in time. At the same time, Roman slingers and archers fired from a distance at the elephants, causing them to panic and trample their own rear ranks. At the crucial moment, Eumenes II reorganized his forces, returned from the west, and launched a rear attack on the Seleucid center. With the deafening sound of horns and flaming darts, the catapults from behind completely drove the war elephants out of control. The Seleucid center, once considered the iron fortress, collapsed into pieces like clay, meeting the hammer of heaven. The phalangites began to abandon their spears and flee the battlefield. To the north, the Seleucid left wing, the mercenary units, archers, and light cavalry stationed near the Hermos River also collapsed. They were attacked by Roman forces from the southwest and south, forcing the entire line back into the lands where there was no way to retreat. The remaining phalangites were now surrounded on three sides: by the Romans in the front, by the Pergamon cavalry in the rear, and by the Roman cavalry on the left flank. Meanwhile, Antiochus, who had been pursuing the west, could not return in time. By the time he had brought his cavalry back to the center, the Seleucid formation had collapsed. The entire army was crushed, with only a few tens of thousands remaining. Fleeing with the king eastward through Sardis and then back to Antioch in humiliation and despair. The Romans did not pursue, but proceeded to plunder the Seleucid camp. The end of the battle. By the time the sun set behind the Sipylus Mountains, Magnesia was left with only the carcasses of elephants, broken armor, immobile war horses, and dead soldiers. A scene of desolation not seen since the time of Alexander's conquest. Although some modern sources mention casualties of up to 300,000 at the Battle of Magnesia. Both ancient historians and modern research suggest that the actual number was much lower. Polybius, a contemporary historian who lived close to the time of the event, described it as a decisive victory for the Romans and Pergamon against King Seleucus III, with heavy casualties on the Seleucid side, but did not give an exact figure. Authors such as Livy and Diodorus Siculus did not confirm these high casualty figures. Modern scholars estimate that the Seleucids suffered between 40,000 and 50,000 casualties. Still a huge number for ancient warfare and a turning point in history. Higher figures are largely considered exaggerations or legends that serve to highlight the brutality of the battle. However, on that battlefield, the last light of the Hellenistic dynasties was extinguished. And from those ashes, the Pax Romana began to spread its wings to the east, ending an era and opening a new chapter in the history of the Mediterranean. Before the dust of the Magnesian battlefield had settled, the Romans moved with the coolness of those who foresee victory. From his victorious camp, Scipio Asiaticus led his army deep into the interior of Asia Minor. Important cities such as Sardis, Ephesus, Thyatira, Traios, and even Magnesia ad Siplum, which had just witnessed Antiochus' crushing defeat, opened their gates one after another, not just out of fear, but because the people were weary. Weary of a dynasty that tried to live on the glory of the past while failing to cover up its present decline. Antiochus III retreated to Sardis, his heart heavy with bitterness. Within days, he learned that his prince Seleucus had escaped the massacre, and the two armies joined forces at Apamea, a city south of the Meander region. But there was no time for regret or dreams of reconstruction. The king, who had once been called the Great, was now forced to submit, sending envoys to the Romans to ask for peace. But Rome, in the position of absolute victor, showed no mercy. At Apamea, in the summer of 188 BC, a brutally harsh treaty was signed, not only ending the war, but completely changing the balance of power in the east. Antiochus agreed to give up all the territory west of the Taurus Mountains. That is, all of Asia Minor, the land that had been considered the western heart of the Seleucid Empire. He had to pay a war indemnity of 20,000 talents of silver to be paid in 12 years, and to surrender all his war elephants, destroy almost his entire fleet, and pledged not to recruit mercenaries from Europe, nor to harbor any enemies of Rome. However, the greatest loss was not in money or land, but in people. Rome demanded that he hand over dozens of royal hostages, including two names that would go down in history: Hannibal, the legendary Carthaginian general who had terrorized the Italian peninsula, and the young prince Antiochus Epiphanes, who would become one of the most controversial kings in the history of the Orient. With a stroke of the pen at Apamea, the two most dangerous enemies that Rome had ever feared were locked in place, and the Mediterranean, as the Romans proudly proclaimed, would become Mare Nostrum, our sea. At Pergamon, his loyal ally, Eumenes II, was awarded all of Western Asia Minor, from a small kingdom on the Aegean coast. He became the master of the East, ruling over much of the land that had once belonged to Seleucus. But this was not an unconditional reward. Pergamon became a Roman proxy, a political satellite that paved the way for Roman influence to spread deep into Asia without laying a single colonial brick. The victory at Magnesia marked not only the end of a war, but also the end of an era. For the first time in history, the Hellenistic world, conquered and divided by Alexander the Great, had to acknowledge the new superpower status of the West, the Macedonian phalanx. Once invincible under Alexander, was crushed by the flexible tactics of the Roman legions. From now on, no Hellenistic dynasty could claim independence without looking to Rome. Under the shadow of the eagles, the eastern kingdoms gradually became pawns on the grand chessboard of the Roman Empire. Apamea was the bolt that locked the old door and opened a new era, the era of Rome in Asia. The victory at Magnesia did more than just end a war. It overturned the order of power that had been established for more than a century. Since the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, Asia Minor and the East had been the private theater of Hellenistic dynasties. Emperors who spoke Greek ruled on the Persian model and dreamed of recreating the greatness that Alexander had achieved. But after Magnesia, it was Rome, a power that had never formally entered Asia, that tore away the Hellenistic curtain and stepped in as a new director. The impact of the outcome was not measured in maps alone. The Treaty of Apamea was a knife cut across the map of Asia. The Seleucids lost all of Asia Minor and were driven back to Syria, Babylon, and the Iranian plateau, transforming a continent-spanning power into a fragile, compact entity. Antiochus the Great's power crumbled, and within a generation, internal strife broke out. Vassals revolted, and the Parthians broke away and would eventually replace Seleucus as masters of the East. If Magnesia marked the end of Seleucid expansion, it was also the beginning of the rise of indigenous Iranian powers. For Rome, the victory marked the first time they had crossed the seas, defeating an empire outside the Italian peninsula. And they did so not through sheer force, but through a network of allies: Pergamon, Rhodes, and the Greek city-states. They did not need to build their empire by garrisoning troops as Alexander had done, but by skillfully distributing rewards, controlling from afar, and instilling loyalty through threats and gifts. This was the first time Rome used a victory to establish a long-term sphere of influence, and thus the semi-colonial form was born. Pergamon and Rhodes grew strong, but always remained within Rome's orbit. Culturally, Magnesia marked the beginning of Rome's subtle penetration of the Hellenistic world. Roman soldiers brought back not only spoils of war, but also artistic, philosophical, and linguistic values from Asia Minor and Greece. But on the contrary, it was political domination that gradually made Greek culture lose its historical orientation. From now on, it was part of Rome, not its master. After Magnesia, Rome began to imagine itself not just as an Italian power, but as a Mediterranean power. They saw that they could subjugate any dynasty given the right reason and the right opportunity. In the following centuries, the model of intervention, alliances, quick strikes, and rewards would be applied by Rome to Macedonia, to Numidia, to Ptolemy in Egypt. And that's how the story goes. History isn't just dates and battles. History isn't just dates and battles. It's the echoes of voices who dared, who fell, who shaped our world. If Magnesia's story made you pause, made you feel, then don't keep it to yourself like a secret buried in the dust. Let it roar like a legion's march, spread like wildfire across timelines and minds. Hit that subscribe button, not just for more stories, but for a front row seat to the human saga itself. Ready for the next journey, because history is waiting, and so are we. Because history is waiting, and so are we.